Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We welcome those, of course, who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Would ask everyone here in the house if you'll be so kind to make that last courtesy check that your cell phones have been turned off. It will be appreciated as we prepare to begin. We will post the program within 24 hours on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. And of course, our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion this afternoon is Dr. Matthew Spaulding. He is Vice President for American Studies and Director of our B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles in Politics. He serves as an adjunct fellow at the Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship. He was also the executive editor of the Heritage Guide to the Constitution, a line-by-line analysis of each clause of the Constitution. And his most recent book was We Still Hold These Truths, Rediscovering Our Principles, Reclaiming Our Future. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Matt Spaulding. Matt?
Good afternoon. Welcome to Heritage, and I'm glad you're here on this, the coolest day of the summer. Proving once again that Washington, D.C. is literally a swamp. From the very beginning, America's founders warned against relying on parchment barriers when it came to the protections against not only human nature, but the encroachments of government. Don't get me wrong, the words of the Constitution are important. They were then, they are today. But the real protections of American constitutionalism came from what they called auxiliary precautions. I want to say a few words about federalism as a setup to this conversation so that we have it in the right context. The process of representation, as opposed to direct democracy, would filter the immediate passions of democracy, aided by dividing Congress into two chambers. A wider geographic area would weaken narrow opinions and decrease the likelihood of single-issue dominance. The separation of powers would divide power and set parts of government against each other, checking them, competing with each other, making those interests of the individuals coincide with the constitutional rights of the place. Of those elements, one of the most significant, I would argue, a vertical version of the separation of powers, is called federalism. Likely taken for granted today, if not ignored, it is perhaps the key structural mechanism of American government, one of the most unique, literally invented at the Constitutional Convention. We have a compound republic, partly national, partly federal, neither one of sovereign states, that one hoped for by the anti-federalists and advocated today by some, what I will call neo-nullificationists, nor on the other hand was it a wholly unified national government, the great dream of the left. It was a regime of sovereign people acting within individual constitutional states with numerous indefinite powers under a constitution, the supremacy of the United States Constitution. The result, according to Madison, was not a chaotic system of the Articles of Confederation, nor a precursor to the modern welfare state, but, consistent with his arguments, you'll remember from the Federalist Papers, a dynamic system of individual, diverse, competing states, acting largely independently under the Constitution's rule of law. It is this sense of federalism, of the dynamism and diversity of federalism, what Matt Mayer in a report he was passing outside calls competitive federalism, that was the founders' original design. It was also this sense of federalism that came under withering attack from the progressives in the early 20th century, who sought to consolidate that power and authority of government to create a new vision of what they call the administrative state. That fight over the progressive state plays out over the course of the 20th century, the New Deal, the Great Society, and is in many ways a fight we're having today in our politics. The key threat to all those changes and to those debates, I would argue, has always been about the integrity of our structural institutions, especially federalism, which was famously called the sheet anchor of our liberty. In recovering federalism, two important challenges are to identify the model of true federalism on the one hand, and to find ways to encourage and instigate its recovery. Both of those things are addressed in our presentations today. I believe the real dynamic of federalism, as well as the most promising avenues of recovery, are to be found not in silver bullet legislative solutions or narrow courtroom decisions, but in the competitive interactions of 50 states pursuing their political, cultural, and economic interests. It's quite simple, actually. And that is what we're talking about today. The American Legislative Exchange Council is a great organization, the largest nonpartisan voluntary membership organization of state legislatures in the United States. And they've just released the 6th State Economic Competitive Index, Rich States, Poor States. There are copies outside. I'm sure you can get more. And I believe at alec.org they can see that as well. They just released the 6th version of this report. It's a great report. And the results are not only interesting, I'm happy to say that my state of Virginia made the top 10, but they're also illustrative of the still operative practical realities of Madisonian federalism. And noting and encouraging these differences, both successes and failures, very importantly, will bolster that model. Our two guests today are among things editors of that report, and they're going to tell us about it and its implications. Jonathan Williams is director of the Center for State Fiscal Reform and the Tax and Fiscal Policy Task Force at ALEC. He does great work there with state policymakers, congressional leaders, and members of the private sector to develop free market fiscal policy solutions for the states. Prior to joining ALEC, he served as staff economist at the Tax Foundation. He'll be followed by Steve Moore. Steve is an editorial board member and senior economics writer with the Wall Street Journal. I'm sure you've seen much of his writing and perhaps his other appearances. Steve has come to us, has come to be one of the most influential economic experts in Washington. His roots go back to the Reagan administration.
And the Heritage.
To think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute, and also his founding work with the Club for Growth. He was a key architect of the famous Army flat tax plan while working on Capitol Hill. This report and these two individuals, by arguing for market solutions at the state level, I would suggest to you, to put this in its proper context, are also, in doing so, great advocates of Madisonian constitutionalism, which is the greatest protector of our life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And that's why we want to talk about this today.
So Matt, can we use that as the introduction to our next report? That was awesome. Really fantastic. Thank you for that.
So, Jonathan, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Matt. And good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to our friends at the Heritage Foundation for hosting us today. We've been kindred spirits for many years. In fact, we were both founded in 1973 by many of the same individuals, and so we have a lot in common. And in fact, I think at one point we shared office space. We probably rented it from you guys, but we shared office space at one point anyways. And so I like to think, Ronald Reagan used to say, Washington is an island surrounded by reality. And I think it becomes that way more every day. But I like to think that Heritage is a little reality on that island. And our friends here continue the good work for free enterprise and market-based solutions, and of course this issue of federalism that we're talking about today. So thank you for all of your good work over these 40 years. And I'd like to talk a little bit about some of our most recent research today in Rich States, Poor States. It's hard to believe we are in the 6th edition of this report, Steve. 6 years ago when we did the first edition, 42 states had budget surpluses. Things were a little different back then. Of course, then we had the downturn. We had states going through some massive budget problems. We had this unfounded idea of bailing out the states with more of your hard-earned tax dollars that came out of Washington in 2009. And now we start to see the states getting on their own footing once again. Just yesterday, for instance, Governor McCrory signed one of the largest tax cuts in state history in North Carolina. We've seen more than 15 states cut taxes on a substantive level this year. So I think we are moving in the right direction on some of the fiscal issues. Now, why we came up with this project was to give our 2,000 state legislators, and I see one of whom is in the room today, Delegate Ron George from Maryland. Thank you for joining us, sir. We'd like to give them the resources to help fight the fight on keeping government limited and keeping taxes at a reasonable level. And when it comes to my personal story, this is a very personal issue for me. I come from Saginaw, Michigan. I don't know if anybody's been to Saginaw, Michigan. It was a town of 100,000 people in 1960. Today it's hovering just under 50,000 people. Of course, take that to Detroit, which had 2.2 million people in the 1950s, 700,000 today. Huge parts of the city basically being bulldozed over, actually paved roads are getting turned into gravel roads to save on the upkeep. This is the consequence of getting policy wrong. And what we talk about in rich states, poor states is really the concept of Justice Brandeis, that the states are laboratories of democracy, and we can take some good lessons and learn those and see from the states what are doing things right, and of course learn from also the bad examples, as Matt said. Unfortunately, with the 30-some tax increases in Maryland over the last few years under Governor O'Malley, certainly one of the bad examples. My home state of Virginia now, of course, made the top 5. So you see a really good contrast here just on two sides of the Potomac.
Not so sure.
Yeah, they did raise a few taxes, so they may be headed in the wrong direction. So 3 areas that we basically focus on in rich states, poor states, I'm going to go over very briefly and then turn it over to Steve. We focus on budgets. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about the huge spikes in the troughs that states have seen. One thing that often gets misreported on budgets is, it's often talked about there was a shortage of tax revenue at the state level, and that's why states were in bad budget problems after the 2008-2009 period. However, our friends at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University pointed out that state and local spending actually grew 90% faster than the private economy from 2000 to 2009. So states were certainly setting themselves up for failure with a huge increase in state spending at that level during that time period. When it comes to pensions, this is, I think, the #1 fiscal problem facing states. This is something we've been talking about for several years. Bob Williams is here from State Budget Solutions, who's been talking about that issue for many years. Do we need any more, a better example than when the SEC took action against Illinois a couple of months ago, because its basic fraudulent accounting of government pensions has caused that state to become an economic basket case. Now, if you believe the government accounting statistics, $17 million a day are being added to Illinois' unfunded liability in its and pension systems. $17 million a day are being added just by doing nothing. Now, this is not a partisan issue. Rahm Emanuel is actually, of course, never let a good crisis go to waste, Rahm Emanuel, is actually said that we need to take action on this issue, and if they do not take action in Illinois, the property taxes for the city of Chicago are going to go up by 150%, according to Mayor Emanuel, if no pension reform is takes action in the next couple of years. Governor Quinn has actually, you may think it's a bit of a ploy, but Governor Quinn has actually said we're going to withhold legislators' salaries in the state of Illinois until something gets done on pensions. This is the, I think, existential question from a financial perspective for states going forward. This is the issue of not how bad it is in some states. Certainly not all states are in the situation of Illinois, but it's a question of, when do you get to this situation of Illinois and California and some of the states that they're headed in that direction. And then when it comes to taxes, this is one of the big areas that we talk about in rich states, poor states. Taxes, regulation, government spending, these are really the core of rich states, poor states. And we develop a ranking system based on the states, and this is something that's pretty unique to rich states, poor states, based on 15 equally weighted factors: tax rates, regulatory policy, labor policy, and then weight them equally to come up with more or less a free market index of how a state is doing in terms of economic outlook. Now, taxes, when it comes to this, I'm a tax economist by trade, and usually when I say that, people head and flee for the exits because it usually gets kind of boring with a lot of numbers. But we promise you we won't do that to you today. You all know the difference between an introverted tax economist and an extroverted tax economist, right? The introverted tax economist looks at his shoes when he talks to you, but the extroverted tax economist looks at your shoes when he talks to you. So that's the world that we come from. Sorry in advance. But when it comes to taxes, not all taxes are created equal at the state level. And I think that's very important because states get a majority of their funds either from sales taxes or income taxes at the state level, and property taxes generally at the local level. And we think that taxes on capital, taxes, when you tax factors that are most mobile, certainly you have a bigger economic drag on the economy than other taxes. And so while all taxes may influence behavior and harm economic growth, we think capital-based taxes, taxes on income, are some of the most damaging. And that's really one of the things that we've done in rich states, poor states over the years, is document how how, for instance, the 9 states without personal income taxes across this country have vastly outperformed their high tax counterparts. And I'm going to run down a couple of these numbers because they're really striking. The 9 states without personal income taxes have grown 2.5 times faster in terms of population growth over the last 10 years than the states with the highest income taxes. We've often talked about how people vote with their feet towards more favorable locations. It's happening, folks, year over year to the states without income taxes. Job growth, also 2.5 times faster job growth in the states without income taxes. Gross state product growth, 40% greater in the states without income taxes. And even revenue growth, because they have this economic vitality in many cases, like Texas, which has created a huge number of the new jobs across the country in the last several years. 59% greater revenue growth in the states without income taxes. Steve and I were down in Dallas last week at the Bush Institute, and listening to people like Paul Krugman, you think that Texas didn't have, oh yeah, he wasn't there. He always tries to demonize Texas and says how Texas is a basket case. But if you listen to Krugman, you think Texas wouldn't have running water or some of these basic necessities. But Texas is booming. They've grown 4 new congressional seats over the last 10 years because of the huge population inflow. That is the ultimate judge of whether you're doing well as a state or not, whether people are looking to come to your state. And that's one of the real things that we look at are these tax migration statistics. So to close, the prize is huge. Over the last 15 years, we estimate that 43 million Americans have moved from one state to another. That's based on IRS statistics. And also among that, during that same time period, $2 trillion of wealth have gone from one state to another. So there's no such thing as building a Berlin Wall to keep capital, whether it's human capital or investment capital, within your state. California, New York, Maryland, Illinois, they're learning the hard way by losing this capital, human investment capital, to other states. Texas is the big beneficiary. But the beauty of the American experiment, and I think the founders would look back and say we did this right, is that each state gets to choose the path that it will take. And it's pretty clear based on our research, the states that are winning and the states that are losing. So with that, I'll turn it over to my friend Steve.
Thank you, Jonathan. And, let me add to my thanks to Matt and Heritage for sponsoring this. I think this is the 3rd or 4th year in a row you've done this for us, so we're very appreciative. So let me just dovetail some comments off of both what Matt and Jonathan were talking about. By the way, I'm from Illinois. We recently, I still refer to Illinois as my state, even though I haven't lived there for 25 years. And we are not doing too well on the list. Governor Quinn, a couple of years ago, back in January of 2011, raised the income tax by 60%, which was one of the biggest increases. And that was, even with that, they still have all those fiscal problems that Jonathan was talking about. And my favorite comment that just rings so true of what's going on with this federalism is it was made by the Indiana governor at the time, which was Mitch Daniels, and he was asked about this giant tax increase in Illinois and what he thought about it. And he said, well, being a neighboring state to Illinois is like living down the street from The Simpsons. And I always thought that was it captures exactly what this book is about, which is that there is incredible economic competition between the states. Matt, I would make the argument that the left is trying to suppress that economic competition. They don't want states competing on the basis of tax rates or how much money they spend or their regulations or whether the right to work laws. By the way, the two things that we find very consistently over the 6 years we've done this study is when we talk to state legislators, the two things that matter most, and there are 100 factors that obviously influence why one city or one state grows faster than another, but the two that are, in my opinion, and I think the research shows this very clearly, are the most important is how high your income tax rate is. Obviously, the lower the income tax rate, the better in terms of growth. And the second is whether you're a right-to-work state or not a right-to-work state. And right now we're, 24 right-to-work states? So there are 24. One of the big, sometimes we get very down and dreary about our conservative movement. I would make the case that two of the most important developments in the country over the last 2 or 3 years were what happened in Indiana and Michigan, that those two traditionally urban Democratic states passed right-to-work laws. So what I wanted to just throw out there as an idea, we can talk about this during the Q&A, is that I'm working on this book now separate from what we do with ALEC, on this premise that what is happening in America today is, as Jonathan just sort of touched on, is one of the biggest transfers of wealth within the country that we've seen since the founding of our nation. And that if you look at the last two elections, the most important trend that really happened wasn't so much what happened on the national level. Obviously, the national presidential race was extremely important. But I would say that that is kind of clouded over what's happening, which is of much more important long-term consequences, which is that the blue states in America are getting bluer and the red states in America are getting redder. And you see this in a grand scale in what's happening with state legislatures. So, just to give you one example, Massachusetts, which is maybe one of the most bluest states in the country, there are 40 state senators in Massachusetts, and 4 of them are Republicans. So Massachusetts, for all intents and purposes, is basically a one-party state now. Same is true as New York. Same is true in Illinois. When I grew up in Illinois in the 1960s and 70s, Illinois was a classic purple state. It shifted back and forth between Republican and Democrat. Today, Illinois is a completely blue state, and Republicans are virtually an endangered species in Illinois. The same is true in California, where not only do the Democrats control everything, the state that Ronald Reagan was governor in, today, not only do the Democrats control every lever of power, but I don't think are there any statewide elected Republicans in the entire state? And moreover, in California, the legislature is a supermajority for the Democrats, so the Republicans might as well not even be in Sacramento today. It is a one-party state as well. Meanwhile, what you're seeing in the South and the Sun Belt is the opposite phenomenon, where southern states have become very deep red states. And this has been a trend that's been happening for 20 years, but if you look at what happened, you mentioned North Carolina. North Carolina was one of the last dominoes to fall in the South. Its legislature is now completely Republican, and for the first time in since Reconstruction, 100 and some years, the Republicans have the governorship and both houses of the legislature in Raleigh. And by the way, I don't know how many of you have been following what they're calling these Moral Monday rallies that are happening in North Carolina. If you haven't heard about this yet, I think you're going to be hearing a lot more about it in the future. This is the new Madison, Wisconsin, the kind of protests that are going on there. It's the left's kind of primal scream against the kind of conservative policies that are being put in place finally in North Carolina. And that's happened even in Arkansas and some of the states that had not turned red are. And so what does this mean? Well, first of all, just as an observation, I travel all over this country. I'm on the road about half the time. I would make the case to you, and this, again, I'd like your guys' feedback on this, that the nation is more on a geographical, regional basis, more divided culturally, economically, politically than any time since the Civil War, for better or for worse. I think it's just a fact. I mean, when I go to Boston, Massachusetts, or Sacramento, California, or Chicago, Illinois, and then the next week I go to Salt Lake City and Atlanta, Georgia, and Fort Lauderdale, Florida, I might as well be in 2 entirely different countries in terms of the attitudes of the people and the way their economies work. So this is an important trend, and it really puts to a big test what you were talking about, this competitive federalism, because what you're seeing, to put this very simply and concisely, the red states, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, the red states are adopting an economic model of Reaganomics, right? They are cutting their tax rates. As you said, this happened this year in North Carolina. There was a tax cut in Arkansas. Georgia's talking about cutting their taxes. It's happening in Kansas, and so on and so forth. So those states are cutting their taxes. They are right-to-work states. They are one issue that is a bigger issue than ever before is drilling. The red states are drilling like crazy. Texas, one of the reasons Texas is booming so much is they've gone radically forward with, drilling for their oil and natural gas. Meanwhile, by the way, California, which arguably has more oil and gas than Texas does, those lunatics in Sacramento actually have outlawed fracking. So they're basically saying, even though we have more oil and gas than Texas does, we're not going to go after it the way states like Texas and North Dakota are doing. And so you just see this happening in a very rapid pace. And the result of this, if our premise is right and the evidence shows that it is you're seeing a wealth transfer in this country. Just to again, touch on something that Jonathan talked about. And one of my favorite statistics is in the last 5 years alone, Texas has gained roughly 1 million jobs, not exactly, but roughly 1 million jobs. And California over that same period has lost 1 million jobs. Now, by the way, I'm not saying that every job that left California went to Texas. That's not true. I mean, people from California went all over the country, but they're leaving, and you're seeing huge job gains in Texas. Now, one of the chapters I really like in this latest edition of the book is we respond to our critics, because they have 100 explanations for why it's not taxes that are driving the growth rates we're seeing in low-tax states. You know, it's always 100 other things. Their favorite explanation is the weather. Right, that southern states are getting, and look, there's a lot of truth to this. There's no question about it. That would you rather live in Raleigh, North Carolina, or Minneapolis, Minnesota? I mean, there's no question that people are moving to warmer climates, and that is an advantage of the South. But I guarantee you that people are not moving from San Diego, California to Houston, Texas for the weather, right? They're just not doing that. And so the weather is a partial explanation for this, but it's not a complete explanation. And they have 100 other reasons, and we just shoot those down one by one by one. And so this is, I think, an important development in the country. I think it may be the most important economic demographic transition in 50 years in this country, and it's something to keep a very close eye on. And my prediction is that for these blue states, they are now left with a choice. I mean, we know Reaganomics works, and we know Obamonomics doesn't work, right? And so the blue states of America are pursuing a failed economic policy. And for those states, I mean, I think there's really two options. One is, Matt, that they will try to reduce the impact of state policies by just federalizing everything. So a good example of this is, we're seeing a big debate in state capitals on Medicaid expansion, right, under Obamacare. And look, the left isn't stupid. They have enticed states by giving them money to get them to sign up for this Medicaid expansion. And by the way, it's caused a lot, as you know, Jonathan, even among our closest allies and most conservative friends. This is a tough choice for states, right? I mean, free money, right? The federal government is giving you free money for the next 5 years. Why in the world wouldn't you take this money? Of course, we've made the argument, Heritage has made the argument that this is just, that there's no such thing as free money in Washington, and that, you get suckered into this, and then you're going to have to pay the cost later. But this was an ingenious mechanism by the left to sucker states into doing this. So that's just one example of how they're federalizing things. One of the things, the liberals and Democrats in Washington always want to increase the match on Medicaid, from 50 to 60 to 70 to 80%, just federalize the whole program. Our policy, I believe, should be to block grant and also to reduce the federal share of this so that states can experiment and fix the program. The other good example, by the way, Matt, is unemployment insurance. The way the unemployment insurance system works is the feds pay for a lot of the cost of it, and then states have to have essentially a payroll tax, but they can borrow the money from the federal government. And right now, this is a kind of a great untold story that the states owe the federal government huge billions and billions of dollars because of the expansions of unemployment insurance. And again, they're lured into this by the federal government saying, dangling this in front of the states, saying this is free money for you. And so that will be one tactic that the left will use to try to reduce these disparities between the policies of the conservative states and the Democrat and the liberal states. And I would simply say that it's our responsibility, I think, as conservatives, to make sure that doesn't happen. And I love the title, by the way, Competitive Federalism, because that's really what it's all about, right? States competing against each other. And this was, I agree with you entirely, this was the Madisonian vision, and boy, does it work. So thank you again for sponsoring this.
Steve, your one point about the left likes to use the mechanisms to federalize things and draw the states in. There's actually a name for that, but it comes from the progressives, again, proving this is the strategy. The term laboratories of democracy, which everyone likes to use on both sides of the political equation, is a progressive term invented by Brandeis. And what they meant by that is that we'll allow the state to test something, and then we will nationalize it. Right?
I always wondered why Brandeis would.
That's what the laboratory means, right? As opposed to the sense that, no, we want to keep them competing, right? I'll ask the first question before, and then we'll go to you guys. How does this look? I take the point about red states becoming redder and blue states becoming redder. What about the so-called purple states? How does your study of the debates there, or perhaps does this explain why they are purple in the sense that this is precisely what they're debating? Or how does that play into this?
Well, I want to have Jonathan answer that, but I want to be, I'm glad you asked this question because I want to be clear about this. I am not saying, and I'm just using red state, blue state as a kind of, terminology, but I'm not saying Republican good, Democrat bad, by any means. I'm not trying to make this a partisan point. I'm really focusing on the policies. Now, it's generally true that in these more red Republican states, that's where these policies are adopted. But, in some cases, you actually have, Democratic governors adopting some of these policies. I mean, it's amazing. You won't believe this, but one of the biggest reductions in the corporate income tax of any state has been proposed and is likely to be adopted by your good friend Lincoln Chafee in Rhode Island. Now is that because Lincoln Chafee is some kind of supply sider or he's converted? No, he knows that unless they cut that corporate tax in Rhode Island, there aren't going to be businesses left. But I'll let Jonathan respond to the purple state issue.
Yeah, and to add on to that point, I mean, when you talk about pension reform, Rhode Island was at the forefront of that as well. And you can probably count the number of Republican legislators on two hands in Rhode Island, as you were pointing out. So that's a big development, I think, and it certainly highlights the bipartisan issue of both the problem that we face and what needs to happen for a solution. But when it comes to the purple states, I mean, certainly you can see them taking different paths. I mean, you certainly see, believe it or not, North Carolina, can be considered purple, I guess, these days.
Yeah.
I mean, make a very, very bold move this week on tax reduction. I mean, we're not only talking about one of the largest tax reductions in the history of the state of North Carolina, we're talking about one of the most fundamental pieces of tax reform of any state in the last 10 or 20 years. Moving from a progressive graduated income tax system down to a flat tax, reducing rates, eliminating their death tax right away. These are very, very pro-growth items for a state that is considered, a purple state. I mean, Barack Obama won North Carolina in 2008. And, for some of the others, I mean,
Would you consider like Minnesota a purple state? Because that's moved. That might be an example of a purple state.
Certainly in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Governor Dayton seems to think that you need to raise taxes to be more competitive in Minnesota. Colorado has certainly moved in a direction of more spending and more taxes over the last couple of years. Certainly kind of the quintessential purple state today. Nevada, under split control really, is going to consider a large tax increase on the ballot in a couple of years as well. So we see the purple states really all over the bag, really all over the board, which kind of makes sense.
One thing to keep an eye on about Minnesota is that it gets to the point I was making about people leaving. So Minnesota, they tried to pass what they called a snowbird tax. I don't know if you all know what a snowbird is, but a snowbird is somebody who, lives in a cold northeastern or midwestern states and spends maybe 3 months or 6 months of the year in North Carolina or Florida. And so what they were going to do in Minnesota was try to, usually the way it works is if you live 6 months in a day in one state, you're a resident of that state. Well, what people were doing, the snowbirds were moving to Florida, and they were spending 6 months and 2 weeks in Florida, and then the rest of the year in Minnesota, so they didn't have to pay the Minnesota state income tax. So what some of these states are doing at the urging of the left is prorating. So if you live 4 months of the year in Minnesota, you have to pay, 4 months worth of income tax and so on. So that's another way, Matt, that states are going to use to try to, collect more tax revenues out of people.
There's really an incredible story about that to the extent that states go to try to tax non-residents. We see it with, internet sales taxes, trying to go after non-residents. That way, it's very easy to have a non-resident small business have to collect for a state that they don't pay taxes or have any connection to. That's really a damaging trend when it comes to this issue of federalism, I think. But one of the very most egregious examples of this is California, which has actually talked about a proposal as these Californians retire, they look to go to freedom in Nevada, for instance, no income tax, and it doesn't take much to go across the state line. So what they've done is they're threatening for state pensioners, the people that have retired, they're collecting CalPERS checks, to require them to pay California state income tax on that pension income, no matter if they live in California or not. So if they move across the state line, they're still trying to get after that income.
They could withhold it? Is that what they would do?
That's their assertion. I can't believe it's constitutional, Matt, though.
Fishy, to say the least. Questions? Others? In the back, yes, sir. There's a mic. Wait for the mic to come around. And
Hi, Elliot Geiser here at Heritage. My interest in this is sort of, I think it's a fear that a lot of conservatives have, that conservative states become economically prosperous and they attract growth in population. People from purple or blue states move there and they take their ideology with them. And you know, they're not predominantly, they're voting with their feet economically, but they're voting with sort of their ideology at the ballot box. And so there seems to be an interesting effect that, you know, Colorado, Texas is becoming more competitive. And I guess I wonder what you think about.
That's a great point.
that.
I mean, this is the one, you know, potential real pitfall of all this competitive federalism is, and we're seeing to some extent the phenomenon that you're talking about. I mean, a good example is New Hampshire, right? I mean, New Hampshire has been traditionally a very kind of, I don't know if I'd call it conservative as more libertarian, live free and die. And it's, you know, one of the most pro-growth states, has no, I think it's, other than Alaska, it's the only state that has no income or sales tax, has very low levels of government spending. And so what's happening in New Hampshire is people are moving to New Hampshire from Vermont and especially from Massachusetts. And we're seeing some signs that they're not changing their voting patterns. So they're leaving behind high-tax Massachusetts to go to low-tax New Hampshire, but they're voting the same way they voted in New Hampshire. And that has changed New Hampshire politically, no question about it. It used to be a very red state, and now I would classify it as a purple state. Colorado is another good example where Californians are leaving. You know, a lot of those million people who've left California have gone to Colorado. Colorado is you just mentioned, Jonathan, is now much more of a purple state than a red state that it used to be. So this is the drawback of what we're talking about and by the way, you have now liberals believing that they can actually turn Texas blue. Now, I think that's a long way off. I mean, if that ever happens, you know, the nation is in real peril, in my opinion. But, you know, you've had a big influx of people around the country who are more liberal than the average Texan. And so it's a great point. I'm not sure what to do about it, but it's an interesting phenomenon. But on the other hand, I mean, the upside of this, though, is what it's doing is depleting solid blue states of electoral votes, right? So those states like Massachusetts, those states like New York, my home state of Illinois, every 10 years they're losing their clout in the whole federal system.
Well, I mean, even more of a dramatic case of this, of course, is in Northern Virginia, when people are coming not only from liberal states, but coming to work for government jobs. And so we've seen what that's done to Fairfax County, Arlington, Alexandria. This area's liberal voting patterns certainly have been, been the thing that's driving Virginia's general direction towards more of the purple state category as well. But I think, overall, I mean, if people look and see, why is it that everyone are going to these states that are having these opportunities and these jobs? What do these states have in common? Why are that they have jobs where your old state didn't have a job? That's the case that as fiscal conservatives we need to make.
Good point.
yes, sir, here.
Jim Bass, Heritage Donor. Going back, Stephen, to your point about Chafee, I'd like to ask you about the end game with other states, other blue states, that are becoming darker blue, that don't have someone who is enlightened. And
I'm not saying he's enlightened.
well, okay.
A little bit of light.
on this one point,
Yeah.
I'd have to say that he's enlightened. But so many of the other ones continue down this long spiral.
Right.
What do you see as the end game here of the deniers, the liberal deniers, either who hope to just get out of office before the bottom falls out, or are still drinking the Kool-Aid and so think that something is going to happen which is going to bail them out?
I think that it's a great question, and I think that look, the answer is very simple. Blue states have to change or die, right? Blue states change or they become Detroit, right? In my opinion,
Live free or die.
Yeah, exactly. And so they're in a slow motion Detroit direction. And some, Democratic politicians get this. I mean, you mentioned even Rahm Emanuel. I mean, Rahm Emanuel's no fool, right? I mean, he may be liberal, but he's a smart guy. He can see what's happening to the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago, which is one of the reasons he's, sounding the alarm on what's happening with pensions. the question is whether they will change. And I'm not so sure about that. I mean, the problem is that these states have become so liberal. Like Massachusetts, I mean, can they change? I mean, they talked about, they didn't end up doing this, but Deval Patrick, who, by the way, is considered a big Democratic star, the next Barack Obama, I mean, he wanted to raise the state income tax even higher in Massachusetts. And so I don't know the answer to your question, whether those Democratic states will change or not, but if they don't, I think the repercussions are extremely negative. And what a lot of these state governors are really banking on is what? Who's going to come to their rescue? Uncle Sam. And this will be, I think, another big fight for us as conservatives. We have to say not just no, but hell no. We're not bailing out the Illinois pension program. We're not bailing out California's, high-speed rail system where the wheels are already coming. We're not bailing them out. And that has to be, where we really, as conservatives, draw a line in the sand.
No, that's a great point, and I think that's so important. Back when Senator DeMint was still in the Senate, we did a press conference with folks from Heritage and Cato, all coming together because that is how the liberal states will prop themselves up, is the federal bailout. The other way that they've been able to prop themselves up, it's more of a short-term fix, I think is going to come back to haunt them, is when they raise taxes on everybody, like in Illinois with that 60% tax increase a couple of years ago. What do they do to keep businesses there? Because obviously businesses pretty mobile. What do? They pick winners and losers. Yep. They play favorites, certain companies that they want to keep around that are favorites of whoever's in power. They like to keep them there through special carve-outs through the tax code. Whether you call it crony capitalism or you call it picking winners and losers, that's the model of California, Illinois, New York, is how they're able to keep some businesses there as they give them special favors.
Yeah, my name is Will, and I just had a question about the internet sales tax that Jonathan alluded to a minute ago, and he said that was a real threat for states who might look for ways to collect more revenue than they do right now. And it seems like an odd issue because it sort of pits Heritage and Ted Cruz against Steve's colleague Art Laffer and the American Conservatives Union. And I would like you to elaborate on the threat you see, because from my perspective, looking at the law right now, it seems like a sort of crony capitalism where the federal government is effectively subsidizing some online retailers by using its federal power to prohibit states from collecting taxes they're already due. So why do you see that as such a threat to this concept?
Well, I'll let Steve answer as well, but this is something that we've talked about for 10 or 15 years, as long as this issue's been out there at ALEC. And, one of the issues I think is a big problem is that small businesses would basically be unpaid tax collectors for states in which they have no physical presence. They have no ability to seek recourse of sales tax laws that they do not think are fair to them. That's certainly one of the big issues that our members, and why we took a position as an organization to say, wait a minute, in terms of federalism, this is something we ought to pause before we take action of. And certainly, this is an issue that we have members on both sides of, even in our organization as well, but that's where we came down on really something where if a taxpayer is going to be an unpaid tax collector in this case, if there's not much vendor compensation or any at all, particularly in some cases, depending on the legislation, and they don't have any recourse, so they can't call up a member of the legislature because they don't have physical presence in the state. That's an issue in terms of our membership.
Yeah, I agree with that. Look, I don't think this issue is that complicated, really. I mean, you can't tax somebody who doesn't have a physical presence in your state. It's that simple. And that's a very important, in my opinion, principle of federalism. Because then you're going to have states' ability to raise taxes, and the people whose taxes are going to be raised can't vote on those policies. And so I believe very strongly in this nexus principle. This was the principle of the Quill decision that had to do with mail order firms, and I think it equally applies to sales tax. Look, what is the solution for states? It's for the states to, let me step back a minute. The people who are real frauds and hypocrites on this issue are liberals, right? Because liberals say, oh, we have to do this in fairness, blah, blah, blah. Because the same liberals who say taxes don't matter, right? That businesses don't locate on the basis of what tax rates are and so on. They, on this internet sales tax thing, they say, oh, we got to have a, we have to tax out-of-state people or else, businesses are going to move out of high sales tax states to low sales tax states, which they do. We know that. That's the whole point of our book. So what should these high state sales taxes states do? As the first remedy, cut your sales tax, right? The game is over. Chicago can't go forward with a 9.5% sales tax anymore. And so that's the first remedy, is to get sales taxes down, which is why I'm so angry at Governor McDonnell here in Virginia, well, my home state of Virginia now. I mean, why in the world in this day and age would anybody raise the sales taxes? You're just further encouraging business to move out. Now, one possible remedy of this, Matt, I'd actually be interested in your idea about this. The American Enterprise Institute has put out this idea, is apply the tax to where the business is located, not where the consumer is located. And that way, businesses can shop around and they can establish their factories and so on where they want to, and probably where sales taxes are lowest. And it seems to me that's kind of a nice principle of federalism. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that one?
I think about it.
Yeah.
That makes some sense to that. I mean, you want to set up so it can let the dynamic work. He's exactly right. I believe our legislator friend has a question.
Thank you, Ron George, State Delegate from Maryland. And Jonathan.
You didn't vote for those wind farms, did you?
No, I did not. The offshore wind, or the rain tax, or I think we discovered rain moved, and so we taxed it. I have to. I see Maryland's ranked 28th, but it doesn't tell the whole story in here. And the regional competitiveness is so important. Maryland's losing that battle. April alone, we had 2,400 government jobs created, yet we had a net loss of 6,200 private sector jobs lost.
In Maryland?
In Maryland, in April alone. Those figures, month to month, as you know, they go up and down, but we're losing our private sector business jobs. The migration figures in here don't reflect the fact that so many leaving are the higher income earners and businesses, and we're getting the people who want the services. Maryland has over a $37 billion liability just for the pensions, unfunded mandate for pensions and for health care benefits, and a $37 billion a year budget, which has gone up $10 billion over under O'Malley.
Wow.
And still not paying for things. Our unemployment rate is a little lower than the national average because we get the benefit of all this federal growth, tax dollars around the state being spent there. So when you weigh all this in and just look at the private sector, I would say that our ranking ends up being so much lower because who's paying for all those government jobs?
So you think we're too kind to Maryland?
I think you're, well, I think, I
They're
would say
kind to
this.
other states too.
I would say this, the facts that you state in here, and this is very strong, still send chills up my mind because I whacked her in these other facts that are not reflected in the book.
Well,
Jonathan?
I totally agree with you. I think we've treated Maryland too well for all 6 editions of the book, really. Part of that is, though, to your point, is because of the proximity to the federal government, and some of those numbers will be skewed. Now, I think the real comparison is Maryland versus Virginia then. Since Virginia does have some of that benefit as well. Virginia's been in our top 5 for, I think, 3 or 4 years in a row now, where Maryland was the largest one of the largest losers from this index from edition 5 to edition 6, losing 10 spots, moving down to 35.
Because they just passed the big income tax increase.
Yeah, like almost 40 different tax increases in the last couple of
Actually,
years.
Jonathan, 72. I served.
Yeah, 72.
72.
I'm sorry. We're going to have to update this
I think
now,
I
Ron.
started
Sorry.
that a few years ago because I talked, or last year because I talked about the 37 worst ones, but it's actually 72 tax increases in Maryland. I've got them documented on my website. But
Right.
yeah, it does drag it, and Virginia is getting private sector jobs though, and so we are not competing locally with Delaware, Virginia, even Pennsylvania. We tax higher on retirement income, and we're losing our young people and the people that are retiring also. So the migration is not fully reflected in here, all these other figures. And it would be nice to see those kind of added. It's a lot more work for you.
That
Well-
would be harder in Maryland next time.
In some of the big prizes, the Northrop Grummons and the Hiltons and some of these corporations that have been looking to invest in the D.C. area and actually move their headquarters to this area, I think they considered Maryland and Virginia. They may have considered D.C. for about 10 seconds. But, none of them went to Maryland. Virginia, right to work, lower taxes, that's the formula that drew them there.
You know, you mentioned,
In DC, what we do is we get them to come here, and then we
I was just
impose the
gonna say that.
regulations, tell them to raise their
And that, by the way, I mean, that's a big story, I think, for DC. I've been writing a lot about this recently, that we're talking about the super minimum wage they want to apply to Walmart. I mean, you can get away with that, right? I mean, they're under construction, they've invested tens of millions of dollars to build these stores, and they were suitors. They tried to get everything they could to get Walmart to come in, and then they said, oh, by the way, you know, you have to pay $12.50 an hour minimum wage, and by the way, no union company has to pay those wages. And, you know, you can kind of sucker a business into doing that once, but it has profound implications for the next business you want to, you want to come. I mean, what next big retailer is going to want to come into
Are
to
there two
DC?
or three other Walmart stores they haven't built yet?
Yeah, and there's three that are not under construction that may not come at all.
Matt Mayer over here.
Matt Mayer, Liberty Foundation of America. Great discussion, really appreciate it. One of the things outside of tax policy I'd like to get your thoughts on is how do you increase competitive federalism outside of the tax issue? Because as you know, Medicaid is a great example. Outside of even the expansion of Obamacare, governors and state legislators have their hands tied. They always hit that federal wall eventually. So what other ideas would you have about trying to
Cut federal government spending as much as possible. Just the more you cut federal government spending, the better it is for federalism, because, and then cut taxes too. I mean, the more you can have the tax systems based in the states and not a huge federal program, the better it is for federalism. That's my short answer. But do you have any?
Absolutely. Devolve as many of the responsibilities back to the state level. I mean, it's something that the 10th Amendment was all about. That's something that should be a no-brainer. And then, when it comes to the state legislator's perspective, one of the most difficult decisions you can make is turn down the free dollars, but it's
right.
such a necessary decision to make. Obviously, as what someone famously once said, if you want to get out of the trap, you got to let go of the cheese, right? And that's what it's going to take.
Well, self-serving, I love your answers because that's what we said in the report that everybody got today.
Yeah, the one that Matt Mayer passed out is put out by the foundation. So.
Just one concrete, thing, we both gave a broad answer, but just a very concrete thing that could be done right at the outset is to block grant Medicaid to the states.
Right.
Just give them a certain amount of money. I've talked to at least 20 Republican governors that we'll take 80% of the money, give them 80% of the 100% they get right now, and just let them spend it any way they want. And
Right.
you'll see unbelievable reforms. You'll see increased access to care and lowered cost if you do that.
Well, and really one other thing that I forgot about earlier there is, unlock the West. You look at some of these states with huge percentage of their total land is federally owned, and a lot of these permits for additional exploration are not being granted.
Right.
That's something that we could allow the states some additional autonomy as well.
Just to follow up on that, because we've got a couple of internet questions on these lines, I want to delve into that a bit. Because on the one hand, the best answer is always all of the above. But of course, that's not the one that's going to succeed. And it strikes me that what Washington needs is some focus. Too often, from this end, everyone wants to talk about federalism, the 10th Amendment, and they want to pass, some constitutional amendment or a piece of legislation that'll solve everything. But I think the answer, implicit in what you've said, is to really go after the big money sources that lay traps and that structurally change the workings of federalism. And if that's the case, we should target some of those things. I mean, I agree with your point, cut spending in general, but some of these big things will get the ball rolling.
Well,
Is that the way that we should be
Yeah,
thinking
I
about
mean,
it
Matt,
back here?
what is the most significant social policy victory of the last 50 years? I mean, it was unquestionably welfare reform that passed in, 96? And essentially what we did was first of all, we did learn a lot from what states were doing, and governors like Weld in Massachusetts and Engler and in Michigan, and other Republican governor, obviously Tommy Thompson. And then we basically gave states all sorts of flexibility to come up with whatever solutions they could, and it was a huge success. 50% reductions in welfare caseloads, moving people from welfare to work, all the things that we wanted to do. So we should do that with one by one. We should do either all combined or one by one with a lot of the welfare.
But again,
program.
the implication is a relatively, what seems to be a small reform played out over time could have monumental effects, right?
Yeah, I think, you just let the states take action when given the amount of ability and autonomy to do these type of reforms. States are pretty ingenious at coming up with them. And one thing that I've learned traveling around to all the states now is, just how different Albany is from Topeka and how different Springfield is from Tallahassee.
Really is true.
And a one-size-fits-all is just completely the wrong recipe for actually making this happen.
One thing that, we've had, one frustration is that, for the last, since I've been in Washington in the early 80s, I mean, about half the time we've had a Republican president, about half the time we have a Democratic president. And, like the last 8 years before Obama, we had a Republican president. And I see Bob Moffett is here, one of the experts on health care in the country. I mean, one of the frustrations I have, Bob, is why didn't we just, in the Bush administration, just provide waivers, to all these states to do as much as they possibly could, you didn't even need necessarily congressional approval to do that. And that was a mistake. And hopefully, if we ever get another Republican president or someone other than Barack Obama, you'll see, maybe more waivers of these rules to allow that experimentation, which is a way to pull an end run around Congress.
Bob, do you have a question? Yeah. It might be our last, so.
Just a point about welfare reform, because I was involved in it.
Yeah.
The important thing to remember about that, we did not just simply give the states block grants and say, go do what you want to do. The welfare reform of 1996 was very specific. We gave the states, basically we ended an entitlement. We gave the states the money, but we authorized very specific goals and policies that they had to carry out. It's vitally important to understand that, because some people have the wrong idea about block granting. There's nothing more irresponsible than for one group of politicians to collect taxes and give it to another group of politicians to spend without accountability.
Right.
We did not allow that. We required them to adopt workfare as a condition for getting the money, and that's what we did. So let's be clear about what we mean by federalism and block grants.
Great point.
Very good point. Last question over here. Right behind you.
Hi, my name's Clinton. I have some experience in New Hampshire, so I was interested to see that one of the panelists mentioned New Hampshire as kind of a pro-growth state that's starting to lean purple. My specific question might be a little bit outside the scope of what you talked about here today, but my impression of New Hampshire is that it has kind of agreed, across the aisle, both parties have agreed to keep sales taxes and income taxes low, but they make up a lot of that income by having a high property tax. And my impression of the state is that they struggle to attract young people, to attract families, and to attract workers to their state because of this high property tax. It's very difficult to own a home in New Hampshire. And my question essentially is can a state kind of take this pro-growth mentality, have low sales taxes, have low income taxes, but get some of their tax wrong? Can you get this pro-growth policy wrong and end up kind of shooting yourself in the foot in the process of creating growth, attracting companies?
Well, I think that certainly all taxes matter, and that's what, this issue of property taxes really comes to the forefront. All taxes will harm growth, will change people's incentive structures, and will take a toll on the state's economic vitality. Really, though, and property taxes, though, are some of the most hated, and I'm convinced the reason that they're most hated is that people generally pay them in lump sums.
Right.
Unless you're part of an escrow package, or you pay them twice a year generally, and you cut a big check to the government, and you realize how much government costs you. And that's why property taxes are some of the most hated taxes out there. They don't have the effect on growth across 50 states. They certainly would at a certain level. All taxes impact growth at a certain level. And so, the key is, and New Hampshire generally has done a pretty good job at this, is to keep government as small as possible. So therefore, no matter which type of tax you choose, you take the least amount of hit out of the private sector as possible. And New Hampshire's done a relatively good job. Now, as you pointed out, it's very, very rare for a state to not have an income tax or a sales tax. Even some of these states like Texas, without an income tax, have relatively high sales tax. And so that's something New Hampshire's been able to pull off for many years. Some call them the light in the sea of darkness in New England in terms of lack of economic growth in that area. But I think that's going to be a battle that's going to be fought in the years to come in New Hampshire.
There's a principle of taxation that one principle of taxation is you want to tax the least mobile, forms of production rather than the most. So this is why, Jonathan is exactly right. What is the most mobile form of production? Capital, right? With one click of a of your keyboard on your computer, you can move capital from one place to another. So that's one reason capital taxes are very bad, because if you're going to say, oh, we're going to put this huge tax on capital in New Hampshire, all of a sudden the capital isn't in New Hampshire any longer. You can't take your land with you, right? So I'm not a big opponent of property tax. I actually think property taxes are a pretty good form of taxation relative to all the others. Because,
Can we quote you on that? It's a pretty good form of taxation.
What?
Can we quote you on that? Pretty good form of taxation.
Well, I would say that the other thing about property taxes is, look, if states, let's say you had a state like New Hampshire that was pretty much reliant on property taxes. If you put in place pro-growth policies, guess what? The land values of that state are going to rise, and you're going to collect more tax revenues as a consequence of that. Just as states with high income taxes, they actually see falling property tax values because people move out of them. So, look, I'm not endorsing property tax. I'm just saying, out of all the various ways you can raise taxes, they're not bad. There's actually one. Can I make one last very quick point, which is you all know that the energy revolution is very real. It's the biggest economic phenomenon that's going on in America. States, the state that should be next, unquestionably, to eliminate its state income tax is North Dakota. I mean, North Dakota is getting so rich off of, all they have to do is put a small tax on the oil and gas that they're extracting, and they can get rid of their income tax easily. And their tax revenues were up 60% last year because the state is booming. So it would be, that's the other thing is as this energy revolution continues, and I think we're just at the very tip of this, start adopting energy taxes, extraction taxes, and use that money to reduce your taxes on income and capital.
Jonathan's remark about taxes being hated because they're collected in lump sums always reminds me of my favorite policy change would be to abolish withholdings.
Yeah.
You would get rid of income tax almost immediately. The report is Rich States, Poor States. It's put out by American Legislative Exchange Council. It's alec.org, and you can get more information about there. There's lots of great information in it. It feeds directly into, I think, what we're all interested in, which is this idea of reviving a dynamic sense of federalism, and I think your work has contributed to that greatly. So thank you for being here, and join me in welcoming them and thanking them.